Okay, so our today's topic is Alan Turing and his very famous article on computing machinery and intelligence, which appeared already in 1950 in the journal Mind. And this is a really crucial article. And before we will discuss this article, I would like to say something about Turing's life. And the background of his article and his philosophy. So as you perhaps know, he was a British logician, mathematician, cryptanalyst, and computer scientist. He's one of the founding fathers of these sciences. He's considered one of the most influential theorists of early computer development and computer science. And he's also famous, and especially famous, for the conceptual development of the so-called Turing machine. We will discuss this concept today, the Turing machine. And he was also an important figure during the World War II. He was instrumental in deciphering German radio messages encrypted with the German Enigma rotor cipher machine. And I'm going to show you how this machine looked like. This is the symbol of the machine. And here is a picture of the machine, you see it. And Arno will now tell us something about the technical background of this machine.
I just wanted to give a little bit an overview over the rich research of Alan Turing, because what I think is incredibly interesting in the case of Alan Turing is that he worked in very different fields. And in a way, he was very early with specific seminal ideas, which very often became came to fruition much later. So, for example, and this is an especially interesting story in a way, is the Turing machine, which grew out of a very theoretical context. It's very interesting that this this theoretical conception of an abstract machine with an infinite memory, that this grew out of a discussion rooted in the discussions about the foundations of mathematics. So around 1900, it was clear that the foundations of mathematics are less secure than people hoped. And people like David Hilbert tried to secure the foundations of mathematics by, in a way, theorizing the rules and procedures of mathematical proofs, of mathematical demonstrations. And in this context, it was very interesting that people like David Hilbert and others, a group around David Hilbert, tried to discuss if there is something like a procedure that could decide if a specific proposition, if a specific theorem would be true or wouldn't. So they tried to figure out if there is a general procedure to decide about the truth of mathematical propositions. And the question was, in a way, what would it be? An effective procedure to decide about such questions. So the question what a procedure is, what an effective procedure is, was in a way an open question. And for this purpose, in a way, Alan Turing proposed a theoretical model, let's say, or a theoretical machine, an abstract machine, which defines what an effective procedure is. So it's the Turing machine and what the Turing machine can compute that defines what a procedure for demonstrating in math would be. And the interesting point for sure is, you all know that, is that such a procedure that could prove if every proposition, or which could prove for every proposition if it's true or not, that such a procedure doesn't exist if we have an axiomatic frame which is strong enough to make a number theory. So this is connected to the name of Gödel for sure. But these very theoretical, very abstract questions which are only interesting for people who are obsessed by the questions of the foundations of mathematics, these triggered, in a way, this idea of a machine which, by much more development and by including much more ideas and including a huge history, including many people, this abstract machine was, in a way, one origin, one starting point for that what we call today computers, digital electronic computers. And what I just want to remark as a historical information is, and this already is linked to the text of today, that the wording computing machine was for Turing in these early texts of the 1930s very much linked to the human computer. The human computer also appears in the text that we discussed today. And the human computer is something like, people, very often women primarily, were paid for making complicated computations in an office. These were human computers working in very, very many places in the sciences, working in banks, working in many companies where it was necessary to make heavy computations. But that was a task for human work, human labor. And that's why this human computer appears. And the digital computer is, in a way, today the standard for our speaking about computers. But in Turing's times, in the 30s and still in the 50s, under a computer, it could also meant to be a human computer. This is a kind of side remark. But this leads directly to the text of today, but I just want to add 2 or 3 further hints, because the work and the research of Alan Turing was much more open. Turing was not a guy who, in a way, worked in one field and developed it further and further. He worked in different fields. So in the case of Turing, we do not only have the Turing machine, the mathematical context, and the development of computers in the 50s. We also have questions like, for example, biological or computational biology. He wrote something about this in respect to the patterns in the animal skins, for example, or the structuring of animal parts, in what way we can have computational models for understanding the genesis of these kinds of patterns and biological structures. This is also another field of research of Turing. And what I found especially interesting is that he very often, in a way, sketches an approach. And at the same time, he has in mind some alternative approaches. So for example, with the Turing machine, he defined in a way theoretically what we understand under the title of computers today, a symbolic, computational, rule-based machine. But at the same time, a little bit later, he also conceived something what we could call the first beginnings, or not really the first, but early beginnings of that what we would call today artificial neural networks. So he, in a way, coined many basic ideas, which became fruitful much, much later. And even in one text, he very often sketched and outlined different approaches. So for example, I just want to remember, and then I will finish. I just want to remember you in respect to the last page in our text, which I find very typical for Turing, that he says, okay, we could choose different approaches to construct such a machine that in a way could win the so-called imitation game. We will discuss that today. And the one thing would be to say, okay, we construct a machine with an abstract intelligent behavior, for example, playing chess. But at the same time, we could try to buy the most complicated and most performative sensors in order to teach another machine English. to do conversation. Totally different approaches to construct a machine. And what does Turing say? We should try both. And in a way, by this, he in a way sketches, he alludes to different approaches to something like constructing an intelligent machine. And for him, it's not decisive to say this is true or that is true. It's only one approach that can be helpful. No, possibly we have to test both. And that by this kind of approach, he in a way sketches two paradigms of artificial intelligence research possibly. So that's it for today. Because we have a text, we have to work and discuss on the text, and I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you very much, Arno, for this introduction. I will shortly present the key questions of today's session. We have sent them to you in advance, but I'm reading them again. So, how does Turing conceive of machine and intelligence? So, speaking of an intelligent machine demands to first define what a machine is and then what intelligence is. Then, this is related to the first question. What is the aim of this very famous imitation game? Arno mentioned it already. Then what can the imitation game explain in terms of AI and what not? Does Turing conceive of AI as a simulation or as a reality? So this is not clear. Also, the concept of artificiality, of artificial intelligence, is not clear whether it denotes a simulation or a realization of intelligence. So I think this is, at least in my opinion, one of the most important questions. Then another question is, what is paradoxical about the idea of a learning machine according to Turing? Then how does Turing evaluate the philosophical significance of conjectures? I think this is a very contemporary question. So also a philosophical question in terms of the philosophy of science. So how to deal with conjectures or predictions and so on. Just remember the way of a singularity that is close. Then another question, was Turing right in his conjectures? And finally, which of Turing's discussed objections is the most important one? I think this is also a very crucial question. So I will stop our recording now, and we are then proceeding to the discussion, and we are also going to present some of the most important quotations of this article.